Hello there, friends. Welcome back. In this lesson, we're going to talk about Azure's global infrastructure. So we'll get started talking about what the global infrastructure is and what sort of benefits it provides. Then we're going to talk about two really important building blocks, Azure regions and availability zones, that you're going to be using when you deploy any service within Azure. So first things first, Microsoft's global infrastructure. We've spoken about how Microsoft is a public cloud provider available all around the world. And what does all around the world mean? Well, it means over 60 regions where you can go and deploy services to Azure. So whenever you go to deploy something, whether it's a web application, a server, some data, a database, some artificial intelligence, machine learning, you're going to pick a region to deploy that service to. Now that might be the obvious part of the global infrastructure. What's perhaps somewhat less obvious is the fact that Microsoft has one of the world's largest global networks that provides interconnectivity between all of these different regions all across the globe. So yes, if you deploy a service, you can pick a region and that might be it. But if you choose to deploy your service across multiple regions and you want it to be interconnected, synchronized, and have data connectivity, well, just bear in mind you've got a really large Microsoft backbone network that you can leverage to help provide a fast and secure connection for your solution. So that's Microsoft's global infrastructure available to you when you build your solutions in Azure. Now, as I mentioned, one of the really important building blocks for Azure is something called an Azure region. Let's talk about how you use regions and what the benefits are. Well, first things first, when you go and deploy a solution, you can pick from any one of these regions to deploy your service to. You might just pick one region, but if you've got a solution that needs to be available to a range of users all across the globe, well, the benefit of these Azure regions is that you can deploy your services to multiple different regions. Maybe you could set up some synchronization between those services, and you can ensure that your users are always going to get a fast and local connection to your solution. So that might be a web application, it might be storage, it might be some sort of other service. But the fact that we can leverage all of these regions and Microsoft's global network ensures that we can provide a fast global solution. Now, there's also another really important benefit of having all of these regions where you can deploy your services to. And that's the fact that you can protect against geographic faults, outages. So let's say, for example, that there's an outage in the Australia region that you've deployed your solution to. Well, what you could do is you could fail over that connection to one of the other regions that you've deployed your services to. So you can see here how, yes, you can have that fast performance available to your local users, but also this can provide some high availability in the event that a disaster occurs. Now, the final and less frequently spoken about benefit of having all of these regions available when you work with Azure is the fact that you can deploy your solutions to meet any sort of data residency or compliance requirements. So I might have my solution built in such a way that the data for my Australian users is always stored in Australia. The data for my Indian users is always in India regions, and similarly, the data for my American users is always in America. Because maybe the solution that you're building has to adhere to a range of different industry requirements, something like private health information, or maybe you're working with government or defense, and you're not allowed to have data spread all across the globe. You can see how you can leverage these regions to meet a range of different requirements that you might have. So those are some of the high-level benefits of Azure regions. Now let's just talk through some important considerations as well. First things first, know that when you deploy a service, something like a virtual machine or a storage account, you're typically going to pick a region to deploy that to. For example, I might deploy a storage account to Australia East. Now, as you become more familiar with Azure, you'll see that pretty much everything that you deploy has to be deployed to a region. A virtual machine, a database, a storage account, whatever it might be. When you configure that and when you create it, one of the very first things that you pick is going to be this region. Now, with that being said, there are some services that are considered global, things like Azure DNS or Active Directory for identity and security. But generally speaking, when you deploy any service, you have to pick a region, and that's where your service will be provisioned. Now, also understand that there are some services or features or functionality that is only available in specific regions. So for example, if I want the latest and greatest virtual machine sizes that have only just been released, you might find that they're not currently available all across the globe. So when we deploy our services, we pick a region, and maybe there are scenarios where some services you deploy are only available in specific regions, but that's actually not altogether that common. It is just something to bear in mind. Now, the final thing to understand about the regions that Microsoft provides you access to is that they also create something called a paired region as well. So for Australia East, the pair region is Australia Southeast. Now, why does that matter? Well, Microsoft makes sure that this region pair is typically about 300 miles away from the other region. And there are certain services, like Azure Storage, that automatically replicate data to the region pair, so that if disaster does strike in your primary region, you can still get access to your data in the event of a disaster. Okay, everybody, so that's Azure Regions. It's a location that you pick where you are going to deploy your services to. Each service gets deployed to a region, but you might deploy multiple copies of your service across multiple different regions as well. Now, you might have noticed mention of something called AZs, and that's a feature called an availability zone. So let's have a chat about what they are now, because they are just as important to know about as regions. Now, when we deploy our services, I said that you have to pick a region. That's not entirely true. Within a region, there's actually things called availability zones. This is like a unique physical location within an individual region that you can go and deploy your services to. So for some services, you can deploy them to either a region or an individual availability zone within an individual region. Now, one way you might hear availability zones being described is to think of them as data centers. Now, I just want to call out that that's actually not technically correct, because each availability zone might actually be made up of one or more data centers. So when you work with Microsoft Azure, this is why you'll see the documentation always generally speaks about these things as a unique physical location. You generally won't see the documentation refer to these as individual data centers, but that is kind of what they're like. So why are we going to use availability zones? Well, let's say that we were building a solution that was just accessed by users within Australia. We might not actually want to deploy that solution across the globe to make sure that it's highly available, but we still might want to make sure that it is highly available just within Australia. So let's say we had a virtual machine-based solution. We could deploy that to 3 different availability zones, ensuring that we have 3 copies of our solution, so that in the event disaster strikes to one of these availability zones, we still have our service available provided from the other 2 copies. So the principle here is the same. We can deploy our services to a region or an availability zone. Which one we are going to pick depends on whether or not we want our solution to be globally available or just available within a specific region. But generally, the idea is that if you want your solution to be available in the event of a disaster, you'll have at least 1 copy of your solution so that if there is an outage, you can still recover. Now, what would happen if there's a massive outage of Australia? Our solution would be entirely offline, and that might be why you do also want to have a copy in another globally available region as well. Also, just understand that kind of like region pairs, some services do actually replicate across availability zones to help protect against any application or data issues that you might experience. All right, now the final thing just to bear in mind here is that not all services can actually be deployed to an individual availability zone. Generally, you're going to find services of 3 types. Services that don't get deployed to any region at all, and these are called global services, and they're not that common. Services that can only be deployed to a region, and these actually are very common. Every service that you can configure in Azure, apart from the global services, can at least be deployed to a region. And then other services that can either be deployed to a region, or they can also be pinned to a specific availability zone within a region. You'll sometimes hear these referred to as global services, regional services, and zonal services. So everybody, that's Azure's global infrastructure, and those are the 2 important building blocks, regions and availability zones, that you're going to be using when you build your services in Azure. Thanks for joining me. I hope you've enjoyed it, and that's a wrap.